He did so with the cordial blessing of Dr. Winnington Ingram, Bishop of London, but Dr. Orchard explained to his new curate that it would be necessary for him to be reordained by a real bishop before he could say Mass. The simplest way to rectify what was lacking was to go to Oxford, where the British administrator of the Metropolitan See of India, Ceylon, Millipore, Socotra, and Messina would do the job without any fuss or bother. Mar Jacobus, in his reply to Mr. Jones' letter, said, "Look out for my purple stock. Everybody on the station at Oxford knows me, so if you do not see me, ask a porter." The bishop was at the station all right, and the purple stock made a bright patch of color. But what were even more noticeable were the musty green overcoat and a huge string bag dangling from his episcopal arm. His lordship excused himself from accompanying the ordinand to his home, explaining that Mrs. Hereford had asked him to buy a few things for tea, and hurried off on his bicycle. It took some time for Mr. Jones to find his way to Elmswood, which he tells us was bedraggled, overgrown, and neglected, with the name scratched on the rickety gate. Inside there were cats everywhere, on every chair, and on every delectable spot. There was a vegetarian supper and a frugal breakfast the following morning. Mar Jacobus told Mr. Jones that he had to be very careful as to whom he gave valid orders, because many men sought them from private and bad motives. The bishop then conducted the ordinand to the little sacristy of the domestic oratory. Here was a mass of multicolored vestments, and layer after layer of white linen, not to mention many varieties of stoles and folded chasubles, which needed pins as well. Before vesting, Mar Jacobus shouted to his wife to bring more safety pins. The ceremony started by his lordship pulling a small lever attached to the wall, which set something like the melodious chimes of Bruges re-echoing through the chapel and the house. Mrs. Hereford had already advised Mr. Jones that, like herself, he ought to stick to the dear old Church of England, where there was at least no arguing, no fuss, and no silly business, and where she got a bit of peace. First came the ceremonies of baptism and confirmation, with the holy oil smeared on generously. Before the ordinance started, Mrs. Hereford had to be summoned as witness, because a certain Free Methodist deacon had failed to turn up, as he had promised to do. She sat at the back of the oratory and filled in the time by knitting. Addressing her Episcopal husband, she said, "Do make it short, dear. I've got to get to the baker's early, or I shall miss those lovely cakes." But Mar Jacobus had no intention of curtailing the rite just for the sake of an extra good tea. Mr. Jones continues, "Mrs. Hereford was asked if she knew me, if she could vouch for my purity of character, if she had examined me in the Latin tongue, and if she had examined me in the certitude of my faith, and to all the questions she gave a vigorous affirmative. Altogether I had been in her presence not more than an hour, and she had never once called me by my right name. Still it was to be a valid ordination. 'Can I go now?' came the piteous voice of the Episcopal spouse. The stentorian yes from the bishop revealed his pent-up disturbance and set free his faithful wife, who had readily sworn her soul away on my behalf. This long and elaborate series of ceremonies, which took over 2 hours, may have been typical of the clandestine ordinations carried out by the Bishop of Murcia, for which reason one cannot help feeling that his biographer was understanding the case when he wrote, "It is generally admitted by those who knew Bishop Hereford that he was well liked, sincere, and good-hearted, and undoubtedly well versed in his conviction and faith. At the same time, he struck some people as a very eccentric man, though not unkindly or spitefully so. In this respect he rather reminds me of St. Philip Neri, who was also considered eccentric by the people of his day. The foolishness of the saints often conceals spiritual wisdom and deep humility within. It is a matter of opinion whether Mar Jacobus can be bracketed with the 16th century saint who founded the Oratorians. gathered that both of them were not afraid of defying conventions if they felt it would promote the greater glory of God. One of Hereford's odd ideas was the reunion of Christendom could be achieved quite easily through universally valid orders. All that was required was for every priest or minister of every Christian denomination, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, to undergo a second form of ordination, accepted as valid by all of them. This done, then the rest would follow as a matter of course. As Mr. Rowland Jones points out, Hereford's idea was brilliant, but it is clearly the reductio ad absurdum about the validity of orders. Reunion is never likely to come about in that way. Believing that he stood in the unique position of a Catholic prelate whose Catholicity was not bounded by denominationalism, but that he belonged to the whole Church of Christ totally, Hereford compiled a new service book for his worldwide flock in 1920, entitled The Lord's Supper or Mass. This liturgical manual was reissued in 1933 to 1934. His energy never flagged, so we find him attending Free Church conferences in London, pontificating at High Mass in the King's Way House, sitting in choir robed in Roman Episcopal vestments at a celebration of the Byzantine Rite in the Russian Church in Buckingham Palace Road, discussing international affairs with Bishop Eulogius Georgievsky, whom the Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow had appointed to be his representative for Western Europe, taking part in a Labor Day demonstration in Hyde Park, then more than once calling on the Friars Minor at Forest Gate, E7. Next comes word of him taking a black and white kitten, Freddie, to join Peter and Patrick, already important cat members of the Episcopal family at North Oxford. He writes of rushing off to confer with the Duchess of Hamilton, who, like himself, devoted herself to animal welfare. In fact, the Bishop of Mercia was here, there, and everywhere, constantly traveling between Oxford and London. On one of his trips to town, he took the opportunity to have a serious talk with Mar Timotheos Abimelech, the Meleusian Bishop of Trichur, about the proposed removal of the Indo-Assyrian Christians to Australia. In 1924, Mar Jacobus recruited Dr. Percy Dermer, who at that date was helping Miss Maud Royden with her interdenominational services at a refurnished and beautified Congregationalist chapel known as the Guild House in Eccleston Square, to assist him with compiling a vernacular breviary, which was never published. So far as is known, it was on February 28, 1919, that the Bishop of Mercia performed his only consecration. That day he raised to the episcopate one of his priests, who was a Bachelor of Literature, Oxon, and barrister at law, William Stanley McBean Knight. This learned and versatile prelate was given the title of Mar Paulus, Bishop of Kent. He later became secretary of Spafield's Chapel, Clerkenwell, London, founded in 1779, belonging to the Countess of Huntingdon's connection. Here he introduced ritualistic services in emulation of those provided in the West End of the King's Way House. It was on October 18, 1930, that Mar Paulus, without Hereford's authority, consecrated a fellow barrister, who was also a medical practitioner, Dr. Hedley Cowart Bartlett of Pembridge Castle, Monmouth. He gave him the title and style of Mar Headley, Bishop of Siluria. This action greatly distressed Mar Jacobus, who 3 years before had expelled the Bishop of Kent from the Evangelical Catholic Communion, degrading him from episcopal status in April 1927. But soon after this painful exercise of jurisdiction, the Bishop of Mercia had the consolation of consecrating a new high altar at the King's Way House on Palm Sunday 1927, when he used what was described as a reduced version of the Roman Rite. This ceremony was followed by a low mass, not pontifical, so we are told. Having returned to Oxford, he celebrated his vernacular version of the Liturgy of St. Serapion in the Episcopal Oratory on Maundy Thursday. For the consecration of the holy oils, he used a translation of the Pontificale Romanum. It would have been more consistent with the Serapian Rite, a local variant of the 4th century Alexandrian liturgy, if he had used the Holy Week ceremonial of the Coptic Church instead, as it appears that chrism is never used at Coptic ordinations, and as the sick are anointed with oil from a lamp which had burned before a holy picture, Hereford could have found adequate reasons for not blessing oils on Maundy Thursday when celebrating an Egyptian liturgy. One cannot help wondering why he bothered to bless any oils, considering that the Nestorians dropped the sacrament of confirmation long ago. It appears that they have never anointed the sick and dying with holy oils. Again, it would have been reasonable enough, even if he had been consecrated by a bishop of the Syro-Chaldean Rite, to have worn the vestments of an Egyptian prelate to go with the Alexandrian Rite. For some reason or other, Mar Jacobus alternated a plain vestment of Gothic revival style with the painula, but never the decadent so-called Latin-shaped chasuble. Hereford's adaptation of what appears to be only a version of an older form of Egyptian Eucharistic rite was also used by priests of the Evangelical Catholic Mission at Stapen Hill near Burton-on-Trent, over which he kept a fatherly eye in his status of Bishop of Mercia. No doubt it helped them to believe the ancient legend that a colony of Copts settled in Ireland, and that possibly some of them found their way to Glastonbury. In virtue of his jurisdiction covering the whole of Great Britain and Ireland, granted him by Mar Basilius at his consecration, Mar Jacobus had no scruples about allowing his clergy to engage in mission work beyond the original boundaries of Mercia, even on the north coast of Cornubia, Cornwall, where a chapel was opened at Portreath near Redruth for the benefit of the descendants of the ancient Cymry. A second edition of the Liturgy of St. Serapion was published in March 1927. His biographer writes, "In that eventuality, this liturgy, lost for so long, is not foreign to our shores, and its restoration in this country becomes all the more significant. How far Bishop Hereford and his contemporaries were aware of this, we do not know." Mrs. Hereford died on March 13, 1928. The bishop sent an urgent message to Mr. Rowland Jones to preside over the cremation at Golders Green. The latter tells us that at the end of the service arranged by the bishop, after the body slipped silently into the flames, it only remained for him to give a blessing, which he did, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. Mr. Jones adds, "It was an angry bishop who was to remain in my memory as the last vision of true validity. You spoiled everything, Rowland, by that final blessing. You know very well I am a Unitarian." The memory of this lady who loved cats was kept alive in the Episcopal Oratory at Oxford by the following epitaph: "Most loyal and loving wife, fearless advocate of all God's dumb and defenseless creatures, O Lord, thou preservest man and beast." The following year, her widowed husband felt that when he celebrated the liturgy of St. Serapion, it would be more correct and more expressive of the mind of the East Syrian Rite to substitute genuflections by profound bows. The Herefords had been such an inseparable pair of 20 years that it is not surprising that Mar Jacobus was stunned by her death. Nevertheless, he never ceased from his multiform activities on behalf of man and beast. In July 1929, he moved from his palace to the manor house, Rodburn Cheney, near Swindon, which remained his base for over a year. He was constantly traveling around England and made a visitation of his evangelical Catholic flock at Portreath, where he confirmed 7 youths and 2 girls. Alarming reports had reached him about his spiritual children in South India. He decided to send his Vicar General, Father James York Batley, to investigate the situation of the Nestorian community, and he remained on the Malabar coast nearly 2 years. His first report on the remnant of Mar Basilius's church must have saddened Mr. Jacobus, for he read that owing to ceaseless proselytism by the Jesuits in the Madura and Tinnevelly districts, many of the faithful had been unable to resist Roman aggression. But there was still hope, so the vicar felt, for missionary work in keeping with the ideals of the evangelical Catholic communion around Mariman, where the papist infiltration had not been so intensive. Still dreaming of the eventual reunion of Christendom, the Bishop of Murcia set to work on a catechism of evangelical Catholic doctrine for Christians who refused to recognize any real division in the one great Church of Jesus Christ, which appeared in January 1931. It consisted of 173 questions and answers, divided into sections. For the benefit of persons who could not in conscience accept any of the historic Christian creeds, he composed a new one, entirely in the words of Holy Scripture. Another book he edited was A Collection of Prayers for the Welfare and Protection of Animals, eventually published in 1934, possibly because St. Francis of Assisi has been accepted as the heavenly intercessor for all God's dumb creatures and an example for Christian pacifists to emulate. Hereford began to dream of reviving the order of the Christian faith, which he had founded in Percy Street, Oxford, when he was still a freelance Unitarian minister. He got so far as to issue an invitation to young men, unmarried and without entanglements, wishing to become postulants, to apply to him for further information about the order. A 75-acre property near Berkhamsted was acquired for the friary. The bishop visualized a community of Christian pacifists, observing one of the rules of St. Francis. There was little or no response to the appeal for vocations. It seemed that few youths felt the call to become evangelical Catholic friars minor, much to the would-be founder's disappointment. Christian unity, world peace, and animal welfare remained the absorbing interest for the rest of his life. His ecumenical outlook was shown when he celebrated his Liturgy of St. Serapion in 1932 in St. Columba's Presbyterian Church, Oxford, and in 1933 in the chapel of Balliol College with the permission of the master Dr. A.D. Lindsay. It was in 1932 that Dr. Orchard's long ministry at the King's Way House came to an end with his reception into the Church of Rome. It must have pleased Bishop Hereford when, on July 12th, a resolution was passed stating that the Congregational Chapel was an evangelical free church, Catholic in faith and practice, standing for the reunion of Christendom, social justice, and international peace. Thanks to himself, its ministers were able to offer a choice of Catholic sacraments derived from the Indian Nestorians, or of the sacraments familiar to the evangelical free churches, which did not require an apostolic succession for their validity. If this much-frequented Congregational Chapel in the West End of London could refuse to recognize any real division in the one Church of Jesus Christ, there was no reason why its policy should not be followed in other parts of the Christian world, and so spread the ideals of Mar Jacobus's evangelical Catholic communion. Hereford's brain never stopped working. He went on dreaming of new societies which could be formed to promote the countless good causes he was so eager to promote. On the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady, 1938, when he was too exhausted to give benediction, Father W. E. Jeffrey, a minister at the King's Way House, who was his guest at Oxford, performed the rite instead, in spite of the fact that the Blessed Sacrament is not reserved in Nestorian churches, and consequently all extra-liturgical devotions are unknown. It was also typical of Hereford's liturgical comprehensiveness that he should have adopted the Feast of the Assumption in his evangelical Catholic Church. Although the Nestorians observe a fast of St. Mary from August 1st to August 15th, they do not keep the feast as the falling asleep of the Mother of God, as is done in other Eastern churches. One fears that Hereford was never an Orthodox Syro-Chaldean, otherwise he would have joined with them in proclaiming, "Woe and woe again to all that say that God died, who say that Mary is the Mother of God, who do not confess in Christ two natures, two persons, hypostases, and one parsupa of filiation." Ulrich Vernon Hereford died suddenly that same night, his body clothed in episcopal vestments of Western shape, with mitre and crozier, was laid to rest in Wilvercote Cemetery, Oxford, after a service in the domestic oratory. The funeral arrangements were directed by Rambantoma, a Syrian hieromonk, who happened to be staying with the Cowley Fathers, but he found it impossible to ensure that the corpse of Mar Jacobus was put in a sitting position, as is the normal Eastern custom for bishops. Among old friends at the graveside was Sir Michael E. Sadler, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford. After Elmwood had been sold and the little chapel dismantled, the ashes of Mrs. Hereford were removed from the aumbrey, finding a last resting place beside her husband's body. From the human point of view, one must regard as failure the life of this Unitarian minister, who was consecrated by a neo-Nestorian bishop in South India, and who firmly believed that the reunion of Christendom could be brought about by a system of universally valid orders. Better still, refusing to recognize any real division in the universal Church of Jesus Christ. His evangelical Catholic communion still exists, but it has proved to be ineffectual so far as the means for linking up all and sundry persons who call themselves Christians. Chapter 6. Arnold Harris Matthew, Count Povolare de Vicenza, de jure Earl of Llandaff, Legionary Old Catholic Bishop for England, Archbishop of London, and Metropolitan successively of the English Catholic Church, Western Orthodox Catholic Church in Great Britain and Ireland, Anglo-Catholic Church, Latin and Orthodox United, Ancient Catholic Church, Old Roman Catholic Church, and Western Catholic Uniate Church, etc., etc. Behold a great high priest who in his days pleased God and was found just. Such was the epitaph inscribed on his tomb by the few friends left to the individual whose erratic career is dealt with in this chapter. It is a matter of opinion whether these words, taken from the short chapter at Lauds and Vespers in the office of the confessor and bishop in the Roman breviary, can be used truthfully of this priest of the Latin Rite, who, having taken a wife, was raised to the episcopate in a schismatic church, from which he broke away, and then became the head of a small sect, the title of which he changed at least 7 times before his death. Today there are about 20 religious bodies whose bishops and priests claim that their orders are derived from him. His spiritual children are scattered over the world. Some of them could hardly be called either Catholic or Orthodox. Arnold Harris Matthews, to give him the surname by which he was known until the age of 42, was born at Montpellier, Hérault, France, on August 6, 1852. His father, Major Henry Ochterlony Matthews, is said to have regarded himself as the de jure 3rd Earl of Llandaff of Thomastown County, Tipperary of the Peerage of Ireland. The title had been considered extinct since 1833, and there is no evidence that the Major ever tried to claim it. Arnold Harris was baptized with Catholic rites in France, but 2 years later, to satisfy his mother's scruples, he was conditionally rebaptized by an Anglican clergyman. He was educated at Cheltenham College and afterwards at Bonn and Stuttgart. Many years later, he wrote that he hardly understood the differences between the services at St. Gregory's Roman Catholic Church, Cheltenham, and those at St. Mary's, Prestbury, which were Anglo-Catholic. He attended both without distinction and went on oscillating between Rome and Canterbury for the rest of his life. Feeling called to the Anglican ministry in 1874, Matthews joined the small but select group of young gentlemen as an exhibitioner of the foundation of the College of the Holy Spirit, situated on the island of Greater Cumbria in the Firth of Clyde. The tone of the services held in the adjacent miniature Gothic Revival Cathedral, designed by William Butterfield in 1849, was not perhaps quite so Catholic as intended by the pious founder, George Frederick Boyle, who became 6th Earl of Glasgow in 1869. Dr. Alexander Ewing, Bishop of Argyll and the Isles, a narrow-minded broad churchman, took good care that the students were not influenced by advanced ceremonial or anything suggestive of popery. It may well have been due to this uncongenial atmosphere that Matthew soon made up his mind to go over to Rome. His reconciliation with the Latin Church took place at Belmont Cathedral Priory near Hereford, where a Benedictine priest gave him a second conditional baptism. In January 1876, he was admitted to St. Peter's Seminary, Patrick Hill, Glasgow, having been hurried through his philosophical and theological studies in about 18 months. He was ordained priest on June 24, 1877. The ceremony was performed by Monsignor Eyre, titular Archbishop of Anazarba, who, so it appears, had obtained for this brilliant young student a Roman degree of Doctor of Divinity, which was conferred by Pius IX. Dr. Matthews spent only 10 months as curate of St. Andrew's, Glasgow. He soon found that it was not his vocation to be a secular priest in Scotland. By June 1878, he had become Brother Jerome, having entered the Dominican novitiate at Winchester Priory near Stroud, Gloucestershire. He made his simple profession on June 5, 1879, but was dispensed from these vows before the end of that year. The reason appears to have been thought that he had discovered immoral behavior between two of his brethren. This was not the only occasion when a similar moral shock caused him to make a sudden decision to break off relations with individuals. Reverting to the status of a secular priest, Dr. Matthews found a refuge in the Diocese of Hexham in Newcastle, where Bishop Chadwick put him in charge of a new mission at Dunstan-on-Tyne. Starting work in these depressing surroundings in February 1880, he built, partly at his own expense, a school chapel and furnished it himself. Something went wrong even before the opening of the chapel, for early in 1881 he moved to the Diocese of Plymouth. Bishop William Vaughan appointed him a curate at the cathedral, and he made a name for himself as a preacher. His extraordinary power over wild animals was talked about. To the end of his days, he was far more at ease with God's dumb creatures than with human beings. One day, Dom Adam Hamilton, Order of St. Benedict, called at Bishop's house in Cecil Street. He was then trying to find a home for the monks of Pierre Quiver, who, having been driven out of France, were staying in Ireland. This Benedictine of Ramsgate Abbey recalled in after years that it was Dr. Matthews who suggested Buckfast Abbey, of which he had never heard, informing him that the property was for sale. Father Hamilton wrote, "Our Lady never forgets anything. It is in part due to this unhappy priest that her shrine by the Dart has been so splendidly restored. She will surely have remembered this good deed at the passing of that very erratic personality." It began to look as if Dr. Matthews was incapable of taking root in any diocese, for after less than 3 years at Plymouth, he moved to Nottingham in 1884. The choice of this particular diocese is not surprising, because Bishop Bagshaw was always ready to welcome almost any clerical rolling stone, with the result that his diocese had become known as the Refugium Peccatorum. This kind-hearted prelate found him a curacy at Worksop. The following year he packed up again and migrated to the Diocese of Clifton, where Bishop Clifford entrusted him with the mission of Trowbridge, Wiltshire. In 1888, this same bishop appointed him missionary rector of St. Mary's, Bath. A new church opened in 1881 to relieve the Benedictines of Downside, who served St. John's, the older parish. Many stories have been handed down, both of the zeal and the eccentricities shown by Dr. Matthews. Thus, there is a legend that one Sunday he took a tiger cub, some say a monkey, from Womwell's menagerie into the pulpit. Considering his lifelong love of animals, including anthropoid apes, there is no particular reason to doubt the truth of this tale. Once again, however, trouble was brewing. During a holiday in France, he made friends with Hyacinth Loyson and his wife. The result of this contact with this world-famous apostate Carmelite may have helped to plant the seeds of doubt in the too receptive brain of Jerome Matthews. According to his own statement, however, what troubled him most was a chance conversation in a train with a Unitarian. Even more so, the discovery that his predecessor at St. Mary's had been suspended for immorality. In any case, matters soon reached a crisis. In July 1889, the parishioners received printed postcards informing them that Father Matthews was unable to minister to them any longer as a Catholic priest. The reasons given were that he had ceased to believe in the fundamental doctrines of Christianity and had repudiated the papal claims. On July 13, 1889, the Inquirer, then the leading Unitarian newspaper, published a long notice rejoicing in the conversion of such a distinguished Roman Catholic priest. There were quotations from some of his reasons for ceasing to believe in Orthodox Christianity, with promises of a brotherly reception into the Unitarian fraternity. The editor wrote, Mr. Matthews, like Mr. Addis, finds in Unitarianism the expression of his religious convictions, and it is pleasant to think that his high abilities as a preacher will in future be exercised, not to advance the Papal Church, for which he has rendered such conspicuous service and made considerable pecuniary sacrifices, but he enlisted on the side of liberal Christianity. The following week, Mr. Matthews wrote in the same newspaper, Sir, permit me to tender to you my most sincere thanks for your truly kind and sympathetic notice relating to my recent secession. I must ask your permission to express my deep sense of gratitude to Mr. Suffield, not only for his, I fear, too flattering expressions in his letter of last week, but also for the consolation he has afforded me at this most trying epoch of my life. Only those who, like myself, have experienced the anguish involved by such a step can in any way understand one's bitter sufferings. It is for this reason, sir, that I find your own generous expressions of such great comfort. Mr. Matthews spent about the same time with the Unitarian community as with the friars preachers. It did not take him much more than 12 months, if that, to regain his belief in most Christian doctrines. He was now ipso facto suspended from the Catholic priesthood, though he used to boast that no formal suspension had ever been issued. By way of experiment, encouraged by Mr. Gladstone and his cousin, Lady Suffield, Lady of the Bedchamber to the Princess of Wales, he decided to offer his services to the Church of England, but he was never formally received into communion with Canterbury because he refused to sign a form of renunciation of Roman doctrine demanded by Dr. Benson, then Primate of all England. Dr. Temple, Bishop of London, must have formed a high opinion of this convert from Romanism and Unitarianism, now aged 38, for he gave him informal permission to officiate at what was regarded as beyond question the most remarkable, striking, sumptuous, and abnormal church built in London for the Anglo-Catholic Communion since All Saints, Margaret Street. This was John Dondo Setting's Holy Trinity, Sloane Street. Its consecration on the Tuesday in Rogation Week 1890 coincided more or less with the publication of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray on June 20th that same year, and it was not long before both the church and the novel were alike being extolled as unique works of art or denounced as dangerous to faith and morals. Mr. Matthews performed several marriages in this fin de six Chelsea church, but their validity was subsequently contested in the House of Commons, formally licensed as curate. It was quite in keeping with the honorary curate's unstable temperament as well as with the mixture of French flamboyant Gothic, English Perpendicular, and Italian Renaissance architectural styles used by Setting for this church that Matthews should decide to change his name for something more exotic, almost evocative of the gray pastel paper with white back and tiny gold marigolds which Charles Ricketts had designed for the cover of Dorian Gray. In October 1890, 2 months after the death of Cardinal Newman, Arnold Jerome Matthews adopted by deed poll the names of Arnaldo Girolamo Povoleri, which made more appeal to the aesthetic instinct, although the motive was said to be respect for his distinguished North Italian grandmother, the daughter of the Marquis Domenico Povoleri di Vicenza, Verona, e Nogarote. Meanwhile, Count Povoleri had fallen in love, unable to resist the charms of a Miss Margaret Duncan, the fifth daughter of Henry Duncan, Esquire of Toronto, Canada. It was not long before they were engaged. On February 22, 1892, the rector of Holy Trinity, the Reverend Robert Ayton, who also held the office of sub-almoner to Queen Victoria and had previously been curate in charge at St. Mary's, Graham Street, performed the marriage of his self-unfrocked priest-curate with this lady. It had to be a quiet wedding because society was still in deep mourning for the young Duke of Clarence, whose lamented death on January 20th, 20th had aroused the loyalty and sympathy of Her Majesty's subjects in every part of the empire. It can well be believed that the fashionable and emancipated congregation of this West End church, already famous by the rejection of almost every hitherto accepted Victorian convention in architecture and decoration, got a thrill. They could now say that, like Mrs. Erlene in Oscar Wilde's much-discussed play, Lady Windermere's Fan, produced at St. James Theatre 2 nights before this wedding, the bridegroom had had the courage to sin for the sake of love. On the other hand, the priest and congregation of St. Mary's, Cadogan Street, round the corner, must have regarded Arnaldo Girolamo Pavoleri and Margaret Duncan as another Martin Luther and Catherine von Bora, a couple living in legal concubinage. No matter, the Italian Contessa, as she could now call herself, seems to have found the ideal husband for the moment. Even if the title brought in neither money nor estates, it helped her to hold her own as a Chelsea chatelaine. Major Matthews died in 1894, whereupon his son and heir decided that it would benefit him to take his place in the British peerage, as well as the Venetian nobilita. Having consulted Sir Albert Woods, Garter King of Arms, the Reverend Count Pavoleri put forward the claim to be the 4th Earl of Llandaff at Thomastown, County Tipperary. This added to the éclat of Holy Trinity, Sloane Street, now able to proclaim that its honorary curate was a de jure Irish earl as well as an Italian count, for the rector merely belonged to an ancient Shropshire county family. This rise in social status led no doubt to Lord and Lady Llandaff receiving more invitations to luncheon and dinner parties, even dances. Unfortunately, this happy situation did not last long. In 1895, Prebendary Ayton, who held a definite place in the Victorian establishment, was appointed rector of St. Margaret's and canon of Westminster. He was succeeded at Holy Trinity by the Reverend R.H., afterwards Canon Gamble, who retained the Reverend Lord Llandaff and his honorary curate, and is said to have spoken well of him. Matthew kept in contact with Ayton at Westminster, but when the crash came in 1899, and the canon was obliged to flee the country to avoid exposure for alleged homosexual offenses, and Ayton's name was mud at Holy Trinity, Matthew feared that he might be tarred with the same brush. He cast the dust of Chelsea off his feet, ended his associations with the Church of England, and reverted to lay status. His next adventure, so it appears, was helping to establish a zoological gardens at Brighton. Sad to say, the company went bankrupt. In 1898, the de jure Earl had to appear in court in a case involving embezzlement, tried before Mr. Justice Fillmore. It was made clear, however, that he himself was entirely innocent. Meanwhile, he had regained his faith, and once more firmly believed all that the Holy Catholic Apostolic Roman Church believes and teaches, and rejected and condemned whatever she rejects and condemns. So far as Matthew's peace of mind was concerned, this was awkward, because now he had to face the fact that he had incurred the penalty of excommunication by presuming to contract what, in the eyes of the Church, was merely a civil marriage, thus putting himself in the category of moral cases reserved to the Holy See. No priest in any part of the world, on his own authority, could give him absolution, nor could the sinner receive Holy Communion, far less celebrating Mass again, as he longed to do. A son and heir, Francis Arnold Dominic Leo, was born on August 31st, 1900, and given the style of Viscount Matthew. 3 years later, on June 16, 1903, his father wrote to Pius X, hoping to get the Anglican marriage regularized, but the Roman authorities refused to dispense him from the vow of celibacy, and Lady Llandaff showed no desire to retire to a convent. The only thing to do under the circumstances was to lead the life of a suspended priest, and to try to support his family as best he could. Having failed to benefit financially from the Brighton Zoo, the de jure Earl of Llandaff turned to literary work as a means of earning his living, and it must be admitted that from the human point of view he found his true vocation. For about 10 years he managed to settle down as a Catholic lay author, the longest period in his life that he was content with any particular form of activity. Seldom a year passed without the publication of a book, in addition to pamphlets and articles. Their subjects ranged from anthropology to zoology, though the seamier sides of church history were most in evidence. His main literary output covered the years between 1898 and 1912. He had a ready pen, a facile style, a vivid imagination, and an encyclopedic, if somewhat chaotic, knowledge. His lifelong lack of logic and inability to see how he appeared to other people is nowhere more evident than in this entry of the Catholic Who's Who, 1906, which starts off, Matthew Arnold Harris, de jure 4th Earl of Llandaff, as great-grandson of Francis Matthew, 1st Earl. He mentions his marriage to Margaret Duncan and gives the titles of several books he had edited, translated, and written, but there is no reference to his being a priest of the Catholic and Roman Church or to his children. One wonders if Sir Francis Burnand, editor of this source of reference, or the publishers Burns and Oates, were aware of the unrecorded details of the de jure Earl's career. Still, they may have felt that the past had better be forgotten, for there was no doubt about his present loyalty to the Holy See. He had just written in the preface to a collection of essays entitled Ecclesia, the Church of Christ, also published by Burns and Oates. Sex may come and sex may go, but the Church is eternal because she is divine and consequently one and indivisible, holy, Catholic, both in time and extent, apostolic and petrine, that is papal. For some years past, the Llandaffs had been the owners of a modest estate at Chelsfield, and would regard themselves among the lesser landed gentry of Kent. On Sundays and holidays of obligation, the de jure Earl assisted at Mass as one of the congregation at the nearest place of worship, at that date the chapel of St. Joseph's and St. Anne's Orphanage at Orpington, which was open to the public. The Countess, who never became a Catholic, attended an Anglican church. On May 7, 1907, a nihil obstat and imprimi potest was given by the Westminster Archdiocesan censors to A. H. Matthews' authorized translation of Monsignor Deschaines' The Church is Separated from Rome. Its title page stated that the translator was de jure Earl of Llandaff of Thomastown, County Tipperary. Some sort of brainstorm must have taken place shortly after the proofs of this book had been corrected, and from which Matthew never recovered. For on August 12th he wrote to Dr. Davidson, Archbishop of Canterbury, "The papacy, instead of being the visible center of unity, I regard as the center and origin of ecclesiastical discord and disunion, the fomenter of schisms, and the seat of ecclesiastical despotism and tyranny." It is possible that this moral somersault was the result of frequent correspondence with George Tyrrell, who finally severed his association with the Society of Jesus in 1907. He and Matthew had been collaborating on the third edition of Dr. H. C. Lee's History of Sacerdotal Celibacy in the Christian Church, which appeared that same year. In these 2 volumes will be found stories of all the scandalous excesses which have been charged against the celibate priesthood since the beginning of the Middle Ages. Taken as a whole, they could be more than enough to turn any simple-minded and uncritical reader against the papacy. What must be remembered is that Matthew throughout his life made sudden decisions for reasons which most of his friends found utterly unconvincing. At least 4 of these major decisions were due to the supposed discovery of sexual immorality among clerics. For the second time, apparently on the advice of the now excommunicated Tyrrell, Matthew sought preferment in the Church of England. Dr. Harmer, Bishop of Rochester, in whose diocese Chelsfield was situated, regretted that he did not see his way to find him a cure of souls. Dr. Davidson, Archbishop of Canterbury, with characteristic caution, demanded a period of probation before he could recommend this married Roman Catholic priest for an incumbency. The Reverend Lord Llandaff was not discouraged by the archiepiscopal rebuff. He explained that he preferred to abandon the idea of returning to the Anglican fold meantime. Dr. Davidson accepted this statement, but replied that it did not preclude him from reopening the question should he so desire. But Matthew's ever-fertile brain had now thought of another way by which he could resume his clerical status and start celebrating Mass again. About the middle of September 1907, he wrote the first of many letters to Edward Herzog, the Christian Catholic Bishop of Switzerland, who replied on the 21st of that month. Unfortunately, we have not at present proofs that Catholics in England are disposed to reject the jurisdiction of the Roman Curia, but if old Catholic associations were formed, if such associations were constituted an ecclesiastical union represented by a synod, and if this synod recognized the principles we profess, proceeded to elect a bishop, I should be very happy to participate in the consecration of this bishop, but I do not believe that it is allowed to start the work of which you speak by the consecration of a bishop. We do not wish to create bishops in partibus. This is the reply I have always given when Anglican priests put themselves forward. This and the following letters suggest that Matthew wanted to form an old Catholic church in England, but it is not clear if he pictured himself as its first bishop. The correspondence continued for the next 6 months, with letters almost every week. Some of them refer to the persons in England who were in favor of launching an old Catholic movement. Rather later, Matthew started to write to Bishop Van Thiel of Haarlem, whose replies were more cautious in tone than those of Herzog. It is more than likely that Matthew argued that many would be eager to join an English branch of the old Catholic Church, a few of whom might be modernists who wanted to be Catholics, but could not accept the rigidity of Rome in regard to theological speculation, but the greater number would be extreme Anglo-Catholics who feared the report of the Ritual Commission set up in 1904 to examine evidence relating to alleged illegal ritual and ceremonial. Were the state to make it impossible for them to lead what they called a Catholic life in communion with Canterbury and York, the only alternative would be to form an independent Catholic church in communion with Utrecht. Matthew argued that although some of these priests among this group might be able to accept the papal claims, yet if they had wives, they would have to be content with the status of laymen. The old Catholic Church, he visualized, would not enforce clerical celibacy. A hint of his negotiations with the continental Old Catholics was given by Matthew in the letter he wrote to Dr. Davidson on December 1907, in which he said, I think that a way to serve the Church of England as une église amie may be open to me, which will also, I hope, help forward the movement of reunion of these churches which reject the modern papal pretensions. I have been approached within the past few days by several Roman Catholics who wish to embrace the tenets of the old Catholic communities of Germany and Switzerland, and have implored me to assist them. If this can be done in harmony and friendship with the established Church, I think a sphere of very useful labor is thus unexpectedly presenting itself, one also which it may be my duty to enter upon. Should this prove to be so, the enquiries which have been made will have been very advantageous to our movement. I have long thought that if it were possible for a bishop of the Church of England to accept the services of an old Catholic coadjutor or assistant who could take part in ordinations, the Roman Catholic and Orthodox objections to Anglican orders would be effectually silenced without any sacrifice of principle whatsoever. Such an arrangement might be difficult. I do not know. The truth is that Matthew was now being used as the tool of a small group of disgruntled Roman Catholics who had for their leader a priest named Richard O'Halloran. In 1895, Cardinal Vaughan had put him in charge of a new mission at Ealing. O'Halloran had purchased the property on which a temporary church and presbytery had been built, and it was held by trustees. There was an understanding that, in due course, a transfer would be made to the archdiocesan authorities. 6 years later, the cardinal announced that he had decided to hand over the mission to the Benedictines of Downside, having had much trouble with this irresponsible Irish priest. O'Halloran was furious and refused to depart. Since the title deeds of the church in Maddock Lane were in his name, he could not be evicted by the civil authorities, with the result that his eminence was powerless. The majority of the congregation remained loyal to their former priest and continued to worship in his church, thus causing a schism at Ealing. By way of defying the downside monks, who by this time had built the first part of a church in Blakesley Avenue, O'Halloran got busy with forming a rival Benedictine community with the help of an ecclesiastical adventurer named Henry Bernard Bentham, who took the religious name of Columba Mary, and who had already been ordained priest, probably by Villatte. But within a few months, this pseudo-Old Catholic community was disbanded after running into debt. In the first decade of this century, the modernist movement had led a number of priests to revolt against what they regarded as the obscurantism and tyranny of Rome. As far back as 1903, O'Halloran felt he had sufficient following to ask Bishop Herzog to send a bishop to England to confirm about 20 ex-Roman Catholic candidates from his now schismatic congregation at Ealing. Herzog, however, took the precaution of consulting Dr. John Wordsworth, Bishop of Salisbury, who passed on the letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury. Dr. Davidson advised caution, not wishing to get the wrong side either of the old Catholic bishops or of Monsignor Byrne, who had been translated from Southwark to Westminster in September 1903, following the death of Cardinal Vaughan. There were two other already excommunicated priests of the Latin Rite in touch with Matthew at this time, Herbert Ignatius Beale and Arthur William Haworth, both formerly of the Diocese of Nottingham. Beale had managed to obtain the rank of Notary Apostolic and Haworth that of domestic prelate to Leo XIII. Their diocesan Monsignor Bagshaw, who had once taken the extreme step of excommunicating the members of the Primrose League, had been forced to resign in 1901 with the title of Bishop of Hupaipa in Partibus. His infirmities made him quite incapable of looking after the diocese. He was succeeded by Monsignor Robert Brindle, who, after a distinguished career as an army chaplain, had been consecrated in 1899 as auxiliary for Westminster. There was a general clear-up of the refugium peccatorum. The new bishop, whose ideas of discipline were military, accused both Beale and Haworth of mass stipends and other irregularities. The former maintained that Bishop Bagshaw knew of and tolerated their activities, as he had been almost senile for many years. This is quite possible. The two Monsignori then began a press campaign with a series of inflammatory letters. The result was that Cardinal Vaughan demanded to see their briefs. They refused to hand them over, proclaiming far and wide that they regarded any penalties inflicted on them without trial as null and void. Monsignor Beale retired from the parish of St. Edward's, Nottingham, of which he had been the incumbent since 1896, and before long opened a quasi-Old Catholic chapel at Gunnersbury, W3, where for several years he defied the authority of Archbishop Byrne. Here he was in close and frequent contact with O'Halloran at Ealing. Haworth continued to protest that he was innocent and remained at Corby near Grantham, to which mission he had been appointed in 1905. Since such was the type of Roman Catholic flotsam and jetsam Matthew offered to the primate of all England as the nucleus of Une Église Amie, it is not surprising that the latter showed little enthusiasm. Practically all the priests had a grievance of some sort, and whatever attraction there may have been to Old Catholicism, it was more negative than positive. Matthew himself had too much kindness, sympathy, and generosity to suspect anybody's motives. Meanwhile, he was keeping up a frequent correspondence with Old Catholics in Holland and Switzerland, and by December 30th, 1907, he felt able to inform Archbishop Davidson's chaplain, in view of the difficulty of arrangements for entering the ministry of the Church of England, I have at length definitely decided to abandon the idea and to throw in my lot with the Old Catholics. We shall open a mission in this country for the benefit of those Roman Catholics who are unable to continue conscientious adhesion to the Vatican, and this we shall do in a spirit of perfect and cordial amity for the Church of England, and in no spirit of aggression, still less of proselytism. I am now in correspondence with the Archbishop of Utrecht, who will formally authorize the formation of a branch of the Church in Great Britain on the lines I have indicated. Matthew must have been rather disappointed when he received the Archbishop's reply, dated January 10, 1908. His Grace explained that although he was at all times glad to learn of any movement in the Church of Rome in the direction of sounder principles of doctrine and usage, he could hardly be expected to look favorably upon the establishment in England of another body claiming to be the true representative of the Catholic Church as it comes down to us from the past, because he regarded the body of which he was the canonical head as the true Ecclesia Anglicana Catholica. He could see no reasons for the formation of another society claiming that position, even though it does so in a less exclusive and arrogant spirit than that which finds its center and expression in the Vatican. O'Halloran, on his part, was determined to get this English branch of the old Catholic Church set up as soon as possible. His next step was to arrange a meeting for February 18, 1908. Matthew was not present at this meeting, but was informed afterwards that 17 priests and 16 laymen had elected him unanimously as first legionary Old Catholic bishop in Great Britain. At first he flatly refused to accept the office, but eventually he agreed to do so. O'Halloran composed a letter, dated March 13th, signed by 3 clerics and 3 laymen, requesting Monsignor Gerardus Goul, Old Catholic Archbishop of Utrecht, to consecrate this ipso facto excommunicated priest of the Latin Rite, who had been elected to the episcopate. It appears that this letter and other documents were forwarded to Bishop Herzog at Bern and Bishop Demmel at Bonn, for on March 22nd the latter wrote to Matthew, "I have doubts if the proposal to hold the consecration on April 8th will be adopted in Holland. I know that the Reverend O'Halloran has received a somewhat unsympathetic impression from the Bishop of Haarlem, but it seems to me that it was always a mistake on the part of Monsignor O'Halloran not to allow him to come to Ealing. I have tried to find a reason for this refusal to the bishop, but I am not convinced that the latter is altogether satisfied. There can be little doubt that O'Halloran did not want Bishop Van Til to discover how small a following Matthew had in England, and tried to keep him out of the way. Herzog advised Matthew to invite Van Til to stay with him at Chelsfield, adding, he would come at his expense. The Bishop of Haarlem is not poor. A personal talk with him would help to shorten the discussions in the Episcopal Conference. Herzog wrote on March 27th that Van Til had been in touch with him and was satisfied with what he had heard of events in England, and saying, do not believe that the situation would be improved if O'Halloran wished to cut himself off from you. 2 days later, Herzog wrote that he had been informed that the Dutch bishops had met at Haarlem on the 26th. After a long discussion, they had agreed to hold the consecration at Rotterdam on April 22nd. Meanwhile, Matthew had posted lithographed cards to his friends, informing them that he would be raised to the episcopate on April 8th. While he was making preparations to go to Holland, a letter arrived from Herzog with the embarrassing question, "Est vous marié?" No mention had been made of a Lady Landaf, and the Dutch bishops were horrified when they discovered that the bishop-elect had a wife and 3 children. Although clerical celibacy had been abolished by the Swiss Old Catholics in 1875, and in Germany 2 years later, it remained obligatory in Holland until 1922. As a matter of courtesy, Matthew informed Archbishop Davidson of the forthcoming consecration, but the latter made no comments. Having heard of the forthcoming consecration, Dr. John Wordsworth, Bishop of Salisbury, composed a strongly worded protest to his friend Bishop Van Til, in which he said, "You can judge for yourselves whether a man with this history is likely to become a strong leader in a difficult and anomalous position." The Dutch hierarchy, however, ignored this letter, possibly because at that date they did not recognize John Sarum or any of the Anglican episcopate as true Catholic bishops. After serious discussion as to whether a Catholic priest who had contracted after ordination what in the eyes of the Church was merely a civil marriage could be raised to the episcopate, the Dutch hierarchy felt that in this case the end justified the means, and decided to make an exception to the 1,000 years years' rule of the Latin and Eastern churches, even if from their point of view the bishop-elect was living in concubinage. Matthew was informed that everything had been arranged satisfactorily and bidden to come to Holland. On the morning of April 28, 1908, Archbishop Goul, assisted by the Bishop of Haarlem, de Venter, and Bern, consecrated the Reverend Count Povoleri de Vicenza, de jure Earl of Llandaff. The ceremony took place before the Baroque high altar of the Old Catholic Cathedral of St. Gertrude, Utrecht, which in recent years has been turned into an Old Catholic museum. The Countess of Llandaff was not among the congregation. The historic continuity of the apostolic succession thus imparted cannot be questioned. It can be traced back in an unbroken line to the nephew of Urban VIII, Cardinal Antonio Barberini the Younger, from 1657 until his death in 1671. He was Archbishop of Reims, who in 1667 consecrated as his coadjutor Charles Maurice Letellier. In 1670, by the orders of Clement X, Letellier raised to the episcopate Jacques Benin Bousset. He, in his turn, as Bishop of Meaux, consecrated Monsignor de Matignon in 1693. The succession was passed on by him to Dominique Marie Varlet in 1719, and next to Peter von Meinder in 1739. This last named was the first vicar apostolic of Utrecht not recognized by the Holy See, a schismatic church having come into existence. Gerardus Goul was the 8th Old Catholic Archbishop in the Netherlands, and from him the Antonio Barberini succession was passed on to Arnold Harris Matthew. The Anglican bishops may have had sufficient reason to protest at this consecration from the point of view of jurisdiction, yet they could not deny the validity of either Matthew's priesthood or his episcopate, for both were derived from unquestioned Roman Catholic sources. In 1908, the Church of Rome herself accepted the validity of orders confirmed by the Church of Utrecht, which had been in a state of schism for nearly 200 years. The consecration was reported in both the Church Times and the Guardian. The latter journal also contained a letter from the Reverend George Angus, the Roman Catholic priest at St. Andrew's, Fife, which was reprinted in the tablet for May 16th. He wrote, "I read an account of the consecration of the Reverend A.H. Matthew by the Dutch Old Catholic bishops with some curiosity for the following reasons. I possess a book entitled Ecclesia, consisting of a planned series of writers, 7 in number, all of whom are in communion with Rome. The volume is edited by Arnold Harris Matthew, who dates from Chelsfield, Kent, and himself contributes 2 papers, also a preface. There is an appendix by the Reverend Spencer Jones, reproduced from an American periodical. The date is 1906. Is this recently consecrated Old Catholic bishop for England the same clergyman who edited Ecclesia, also presumably for England, only 2 years ago, and who is then, so far as can be judged from the book, a Christian in obedience to the See of Rome? If so, the conversion or transition from Rome to Utrecht seems somewhat sudden, and perhaps I may be forgiven for asking the above question. The tablet reprinted another letter to the Guardian, signed Incredulous, which read, Your Old Catholic correspondent announces the consecration of Mr. Matthew as first Old Catholic bishop for England. Who is this Mr. Matthew? Is he really an Old Catholic bishop, or what is he? He himself tells us that he is a lineal relative of Sir Toby Matthew, who was a grandson of Bishop Barlow, who consecrated Parker, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury. On close examination, we find that Mr. Matthew is not unlike his relative Sir Toby. He was Protestant or Catholic, priest or layman, Jesuit or secular, all things in all circumstances to gain his objects, and at this moment we cannot discover whether Mr. Matthew is Roman or Anglican, or Old Catholic, or agnostic, or Jesuit, or secular priest, or what he is. Is he a bishop? And if he is a bishop, of what denomination? And where are his disciples? Scientists and modernists, like our friend Father Tyrrell, must recognize in him the unknown species whose evolution cannot be classified. Perhaps it is because he has so many spots or shades of all religions that the mirror announces his consecration as the unification of all jarring Christian sects, and himself as the healer of divided Christendom. It is stated that he has already a following of 17 ex-Roman Catholic priests and 8 fully organized parishes in Ealing, Bromley, Orpington, Brighton, Birmingham, Hull, Nottingham, and Chelsfield, but no human eye can see these men in the flesh. We are told that they are there, that they exist, but no man on earth can find them. Doubtless Mr. Matthew has studied magic, and he has the power, like Simon of old, to do many marvelous things in proof of his apostolic election and mission. Faith is the belief in things unseen, but it requires a very strong faith indeed to believe that Mr. Matthew has, or ever had, 17 ex-Roman priests and 8 congregations in these towns, and no one but Mr. Matthew can see them. I am like St. Thomas. I believe what I see, and I undertake to give £10 to each of these ex-Roman Catholic priests, if Mr. Matthew will produce them, and thus pay the penalty of my incredulity. Mr. Matthew did not accept the challenge made by Incredulous, who was thus saved from having to hand over the sum of £170 for the benefit of the old Catholic Church. On May 23rd, Harmatopegus informed readers of the tablet that the Catholic Who's Who and Yearbook 1908 recognizes Mr. A. H. Matthew as a Catholic author and married man. It is to be presumed that Mrs. Matthew is dead, for the Jansenists of Holland exact celibacy in their clergy. But even so, if the old Catholic correspondent of The Guardian is not the victim of a hoax, is it not a great slur on the 17 ex-Roman Catholic priests who are said to obey him as a bishop, that they were forced to elect a layman, if they did so elect him, to be consecrated per saltum their first bishop? And if they did not elect him, on whose recommendation did the Jansenist Archbishop of Utrecht act? On his return to England from the Netherlands, Bishop Matthew got a nasty shock when he discovered that practically everything told him by O'Halloran was untrue. He had been convinced by the latter that there was a large body of both Anglo-Catholics and Cisalpine Roman Catholics in England waiting impatiently to be united on the basis of an old Catholic Church. The original source of this supposition seems to have been an article by the Reverend Arthur Galton in the Fortnightly Review for September 1902. This ex-Catholic priest, who had joined the ministry of the Church of England, had implied that there were at least 250 of his former brethren wanting to break away from the tyranny of the Vatican and become the nucleus of a purified, non-papal Catholic Church, similar to those existing already in Holland, Germany, and Switzerland. But in fact, Matthew's friends proved to be a mere handful, very far from the numbers promised by their flights of fancy. Immediately after discovering the true facts, Matthew wrote to Archbishop Gould, telling him that both of them had been deceived by O'Halloran. He offered to resign, but the Dutch bishops refused to consider the idea. It has been said that O'Halloran then demanded that Matthew should raise him to the episcopate, but to no avail. As far as he himself was concerned, every effort made by the excommunicated priest at Ealing to get even with Cardinal Vaughan and his successor Archbishop Byrne by setting up a schismatic church in England came to nothing. On April 11, 1908, Tyrrell wrote to Matthew, congratulating him on his consecration, and saying, "Though I am miles from Jansenism, I have the greatest respect for the plucky little Utrecht community, but I thought that Utrecht would faint at the idea of a wedded bishop. Perhaps they are not immovable in that matter. Naturally, I look forward to you making a thorn in the side of the papists, and this you can do far better with the authority of the Alt-Cath body behind you. I think you must use your pen in the cause a good deal, and translate the Alt-Cath literature for the benefit of the Anglicans from whom you are likely to draw recruits. Feeling that he had to accept facts as they were and make the best of a bad job, Matthew wrote a letter to The Guardian, which was printed on May 27, 1908. I now wish to say that having received this important office and mission, notwithstanding my expressed desire that another whom I believe to be more competent and more worthy to undertake both should be chosen in my place, it appears to be my duty to use every possible endeavor that my ministry may be of service in the interest and welfare of mankind. I therefore earnestly beg for the cordial cooperation of all sincere Christians, in order that, in spite of my numerous shortcomings and my unworthiness, I may succeed in some degree in the accomplishment of the divine purposes, particularly by seeking to bring about a better and more charitable understanding between some of the many contending denominations into which the Christian people in this country have, unfortunately, become divided. This same newspaper, in its issue of June 3rd, published a letter from Bishop Van Til, who then acted as secretary to the Old Catholic bishops of Holland, Germany, and Switzerland, expressing the wish that Bishop Matthew would receive the cordial support of the British people and Church in the trying circumstances in which he has been placed. This was a polite way of stating that he had been consecrated under false pretenses, though not of his making. The Lambeth Conference, which took place that summer, felt very differently. A resolution was passed deprecating the setting up of a new organized body in regions where a church with apostolic ministry and Catholic doctrine offers religious privileges without the imposition of un-Catholic terms of communion, more especially in cases where no difficulty of language or nationality exists. The Anglican bishops stressed that there were no genuine old Catholics in England, for which reason no good could be expected from setting up a second schismatic body in this country, the first having been established by Pius IX in 1850. Oddly enough, the Roman Catholic hierarchy of England and Wales did not feel it worthwhile to make any official pronouncement about the new church brought into being by one of its lapsed priests. The bishops just ignored the whole business as beneath contempt. After all, had not Matthew himself written, "Sects may come and sects may go, but the church is eternal"? So far as his own sect was concerned, his prophecy would come true. George Tyrrell, however, did not believe this, and kept on encouraging Matthew. On July 25, 1908, he pointed out the advantages of what he called the primitive household church and priesthood, and hoped that his friend might inaugurate a new and important era in church history by confirming his clergy to men who earned their living in secular professions. Cut off the pecuniary advantage, and you cut off the rest of sacerdotalism, and all the doctrinal and other corruptions it entails. Matthew, for his part, grateful for the support of this celebrated ex-Jesuit, publicized that he was prepared to provide a refuge for discontented Roman Catholic priests and layfolk, and to give them a spiritual home. In spite of the lack of official recognition by the Church of England, he gave lectures in favor of Anglican ordinations, and joined the Society of St. Willibrord on its foundation in the autumn of 1908. Its object was to bring about closer relations between the Anglican and Old Catholic communions. 2 years later, however, he resigned his membership in a hurry, reports having reached him of the gravely immoral life of its founder and secretary, whose sudden death in Tottenham Court Road certainly prevented his arrest and imprisonment. Tyrrell, writing on February 17, 1909, told the editor of The Guardian that, much to his regret, the old Catholic body in England seemed to be on its last legs. From his point of view, this was a tragedy, because he had hoped that the Anglo-Dutch Entente would erect a lightning conductor between the Spencer-Jones ultramontances to rob them and their Roman abattoirs of some of their favorite traps of the ignorant. Now it appeared that for lack of 2 pence worth of patience and latitude, the scheme would be wrecked. It was sad to think that fundamental positions and principles would have to give way to a purely ecclesiastical law, fabricated for a condition of things that was wholly passed away. Who's Who for 1909 contained the entry Right Reverend Arnold Harris Matthew, C. Earl of Llandaff, and gave more hitherto unpublished facts concerning his ancestry and career. The public was informed that Lord Llandaff is de jure right heir to Admiral Thomas Matthews of Llandaff Court, who died in 1751, leaving extensive estates in 3 counties, which he bequeathed under a trust to last 500 years to his right heirs of the land. His lordship claimed also to be a lineal descendant of Sir David Matthew of Llandaff, standard-bearer to Edward IV, 1461. Moreover, he was a believer in the Baconian authorship of Shakespeare, originated the idea of keeping wild animals in captivity without the employment of cages in zoological gardens, the plan having been since adopted in Germany with great success, and has successively acclimatized anthropoid apes in this country. His recreations were stated to be field natural history, archaeology, and literature. In August 1909, he arranged with the Anglo-Catholic firm of Cope and Fenwick to produce an Old Catholic missal and ritual adapted from the Roman Rite as used by the Dutch Old Catholics. Printed in the series of Christian liturgies, it carried the imprimatur of Archbishop Gould of Utrecht. Matthew ordered his book to be used in the chapels and oratories under his jurisdiction. In the meantime, Lord and Lady Llandaff had moved from Chelsfield, Kent, to 151 Fellows Road, South Hampstead. One of the rooms of their house was furnished as an oratory, in which on February 9, 1909, the bishop performed the first of his episcopal functions, when he ordained deacon and priest the Reverend W. Noel Lambert, then minister of an independent congregational chapel in River Street, Islington. Dr. Winnington Ingram, Bishop of London, had been duly notified of this irregular ordination within his diocese. Lambert placed his chapel at Matthew's disposal, and 4 months later it was consecrated as a pro-cathedral dedicated to St. Willibrord. Lambert himself was appointed rector, and several priests were ordained there, among whom was James Columba MacFall, whom Matthew raised to the episcopate as Old Catholic Bishop for Ireland in 1916. Until September 1909, Matthew's only first-hand knowledge of continental Old Catholicism had been gained during his brief visit to Holland for his consecration. A journey to Vienna to take part in the 8th International Old Catholic Congress led to the discovery that the majority of the bishops and clergy were far more Protestant in their outlook than he had suspected. It is related that he warned some of the Dutch delegates that if they allowed themselves to be overwhelmed by the Old Catholics and walked in their ways, the Church of Utrecht would become the Protestant modernist sect it soon afterwards became. There is a story that about this time a union was formed between Matthew and some of the followers of Bishop Anton Kozlowski, who died on January 14, 1907. Since his consecration at Bern in 1897, this prelate had held a roving commission over groups of Polish Old Catholics in the United States, given him by Monsignor Goul, Archbishop of Utrecht. But if this union did take place, it did not continue for long. On his return from Austria, Matthew felt himself even more isolated because, in addition to having lost his confidence in most continental Old Catholics, he had developed grave doubts about the validity of Anglican ordinations. As a result of a closer study of 16th century history, he now agreed with Leo XIII that the intention of the Anglican Church, as expressed in the ordination rite, is defective because the acts and words explicitly conferring the power for priests to offer sacrifices were omitted by the reformers. In March 1910, he delivered a lecture at Carshalton, where he stated that many Anglican priests had asked for conditional reordination, but that he was reluctant to oblige them. This lecture was printed as a pamphlet entitled, "Are Anglican Orders Valid?" It led to a reply from Bishop Van Til, who explained that Matthew's opinion did not represent those of any of the Old Catholic bishops on the continent. He was in communion with them, but in all other respects they regarded him as a freelance prelate, representing himself and his clergy only. Most of his former friends were deserting him one by one. After the publication of Tyrrell's posthumous work, Christianity at the Crossroads, in 1909, Matthew must have realized that if this ex-Jesuit were still alive, their relationship would not have remained unchanged, since the author questioned whether Christianity was the final religion, and not merely the germ of a universal religion which would eventually evolve. About the time of the publication of Tyrrell's book, Matthew assisted Archbishop Gould, Bishop Van Til, and Bishop Demmel at the consecration in Utrecht on October 5, 1909, of Jean-Marie Kowalski as first bishop of the Polish Mariavite Church, probably unaware of the very strange doctrines and customs encouraged in this schismatic sect, founded in 1906. Determined to assert himself at home, on April 22, 1910, he provided his little pro-cathedral in Islington with a dean and chapter. No other Old Catholic cathedral in the world had a chapter except Utrecht. Lace Rocher and black mosettas with scarlet hoods were bought from F. H. Bacon and C. F. Hinton, J. McFall, and J. S. Seaton, who were installed as canons under W. N. Lambert as dean. The bishop was represented with a ring, and Bacon was given the rank of archdeacon. After the installation of the chapter, Matthew raised himself to the status of metropolitan and adopted the title of Old Catholic Archbishop of London. Always a loyal monarchist, he was looking forward to a royal command to attend a levee at Buckingham Palace, but the death of Edward VII on May 6 prevented this. 4 days later, the Islington Gazette printed the archiepiscopal statement. His Majesty had been made aware of our movement and expressed his interest in it. On June 13th, at Corby, Lincolnshire, the Archbishop consecrated the two excommunicated Roman Catholic priests already mentioned, Monsignor Beale and Monsignor Howarth. The former proclaimed that episcopal status would be a useful weapon in his fight with the Roman authorities. He then went off to Caldy Island, where he was entertained by the Anglican Benedictines. Had he thoughts of persuading Abbot Allred Carlisle to have his orders rectified, or even to throw off the yoke of Canterbury and have his monks received into the Old Catholic Church? The Old Catholic Archbishop of London defended his consecration of these two excommunicated Monsignori with the explanation that it was vitally important to secure the Old Catholic Church in England against the loss of apostolic succession. The Dutch Old Catholics regarded this plea as nonsense and were extremely indignant when they heard of the affair. An article appeared in their official organ, De Ud Catholique, on December 1, 1910, in which it was made clear that their English colleague had broken the Declaration of Utrecht, drawn up by the 5 Old Catholic bishops on September 24, 1889. It was pointed out that he had done so in 4 different ways in raising Howarth and Beale to the episcopate: 1, by failing to inform his fellow bishops; 2, by performing the consecration secretly; 3, without assistance; and 4, because the 2 priests were still technically subject to the Holy See. Having read this article, Matthew sat down and composed what he called a Declaration of Autonomy and Independence, washing his hands of the Dutch Old Catholics and making it quite clear that he was not going to be subject to them any longer. His detailed defense of his action was based on 7 points, most of them concerned with the increase of Protestant abuses among his co-religionists on the continent. For instance, they had granted permission to Anglican priests, whose orders he had now ceased to recognize as valid, to celebrate the communion services in Old Catholic churches, and they admitted Anglican layfolk to the sacraments. He also expressed strong disapproval of the new vernacular revision of the Dutch liturgy. There were times when the de jure 4th Earl of Llandaff was unable to see the obvious facts of life until they hit him in the face. Anybody but himself would have realized that what he maintained, where recent Protestant abuses had existed among the continental Old Catholics for a long time. Although in his negotiations with Utrecht he had made good use of Bishop Herzog of Bern, who was a very broad churchman, he does not appear to have studied the 1880 liturgy of his church, Gettebuk für die Christkatholische Kirche in der Schweiz. Had he done so, he would have discovered that it was far more Protestant in tone than the 1909 Dutch vernacular Misbeck, which is a fairly conservative vernacular version of the Roman Rite. The Declaration of Autonomy and Independence was printed in The Guardian on January 6, 1911. The old Catholic Archbishop of London was now himself as the opposite number to the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster, the Bishop of London, and indirectly to the Metropolitans of Canterbury and York. His jurisdiction covered the whole of Great Britain and Ireland, but his duties were not burdensome, for the only places of worship requiring his supervision were chapels at Chiswick, Croydon, Broadstairs, Belfast, and Oxford, together with his tiny pro-cathedral in Islington. Most of these chapels were rooms in private houses. Two of his clergy soon abandoned him. One of these, C.W. Bowman, a former Lutheran pastor, whom he had ordained priest on September 9, 1910, and who had furnished a room in his house in Kensington as a public oratory, dedicated to St. Boniface, went over to the Church of England. The other was an even graver blow. The dean of his pro-cathedral, W.N. Lambert, got reconciled with Canterbury. Both these priests were the legal owners of the two archbishops' two places of worship in London, so all that he could do under the circumstances was to transfer the pro-cathedral to a room in his house in Fellows Road, South Hampstead, and forget about the Chapel of Ease in Kensington. But he used Archdeacon Bacon's private oratory at 33 Esmond Road, Bedford Park, for most pontifical functions. It is recalled by some of Matthew's surviving friends that after the birth of his second daughter in 1907, relations between him and his wife became strained. This is not surprising, because it must have been a disappointment to have changed the position of a noble lady and fashionable curate's wife for that of consort to a bishop regarded as bogus by her former friends in Chelsea. The Countess was often away, and her husband's clerical associates seldom met her. 3 weeks after the publication of the Declaration of Autonomy and Independence, proof was given that the Archbishop of London now regarded himself as subject to no higher authority. His handful of clergy elected 4 of their number and pressed for their immediate consecration. These were Francis Herbert Bacon, Cuthbert Francis Hinton, Frederick Clement Egerton, and William Scott Hall. On January 7, 1911, without assistance, Matthew raised these 4 priests to the episcopate with the titles of Bishops of Durham, Hereford, Norwich, and Winchester, respectively. The independent branch of the old Catholic Church in England could now boast of a hierarchy of 7. The sheep, which when rounded up numbered probably less than 100, were well supplied with shepherds, roughly 1 shepherd for 14 sheep. Feeling very optimistic about a glorious future for his church, Matthew wrote to Cardinal Merry de Val 4 days later, informing him that he soon hoped to Catholicize the Protestant and the unbelieving in the British Empire. He begged His Eminence to obtain papal approval for the use of a vernacular version of the Roman Rite in this small body, out of communion now both with the Holy See and with the Church of Utrecht. Having given the independent Old Catholic Church in Britain a hierarchy, the Metropolitan began to dream of spreading the religious life for men and women. On February 2, 1911, he inaugurated a Benedictine monastery at Bury, Glamorganshire, and installed a certain Dom Gilbert Vincent as superior. 2 or 3 novices were clothed, among them James Charles Thomas Ayliffe Williams. This young man had already tested his vocation with the Anglican Benedictines at Hildy Island, but after about 6 months realized that his health would not stand up to their then austere observances. But this embryo abbey came to an end within a year of its formation. The money promised for its endowment failed to materialize, and there was some scandal about the Father Superior and about the person or persons who were to have provided the cash. Matthew also hoped to found a community of nuns, and had in mind as its nucleus 2 or 3 sisters who had left the Anglican Benedictines at West Malling at the time of the election of Sister Mary Pauline Ewart, of the Society of All Saints as second abbess early in 1907. Now that the de jure Earl of Llandaff had cast himself adrift from the continental Old Catholics, he had to find a new name for his schismatic sect. The simplest thing was to call it the English Catholic Church. The day after their consecration, the titular bishops of Durham, Hereford, Norwich, and Winchester elected him Anglo-Catholic Archbishop of London and duly notified the Holy See. As a result, their consecrator was put under a major excommunication. This was reported in the Times on February 28, 1911. Matthew was furious and wrote to Cardinal Mary del Val, protesting against this papal action. He also instructed his solicitor to issue a writ for libel against the Times Publishing Company Limited. In spite of the fact that he and his associates had been anathematized and excommunicated in the papal decree of February 11, 1911, and the faithful warned against all contact with him, Matthew had the temerity that same day to write to Monsignor John Cuthbert Headley, Order of St. Benedict, Bishop of Newport and Menevia, with a proposal to set up a Uniate church in Britain. He informed him that there were many discontented Anglo-Catholics waiting to join such a body. Having met with no encouragement in this matter, he made a similar suggestion to Cardinal Mary del Val on May 14th and said, "It would be very desirable that a Uniate body should be formed, and that it should be directly subject to the Holy See, at any rate for some time." Strange to say, the then Papal Secretary of State did not agree with the Anglo-Catholic Archbishop of London, and no more was heard of the proposal. Meanwhile, the Church of Utrecht had published a devastating reply to the Declaration of Autonomy and Independence. As on so many occasions, Matthew contrived to defend himself. On February 17, 1911, he explained to readers of The Guardian that he had not broken away from this church or from other continental Old Catholic bodies. All he had done was to emphasize his independent status in Britain. He managed to find what he felt were convincing reasons in favor of other actions criticized by the Dutch bishops. Another defense of his position and polity followed on April 28th, but there was no need for him to be depressed. A wealthy lady had offered to pay for the erection of a cathedral in London, in which he would be able to pontificate in a manner befitting the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the English Catholic Church, the style which he gave himself in March 1911. All this sort of thing sounds quite crazy today, but did not seem so early in 1912. Matthew knew that there were a number of extreme Anglo-Catholic incumbents whose churches were banned by their respective bishops, and who appeared to be quite content to remain in this state of spiritual isolation so long as they could say Mass in the vernacular with the ceremonial of the Latin Rite. A few, however, did wake up to their illogical position, and it was in 1910 that took place what were known as the Brighton Troubles, with several priests in that town and many members of their congregations being reconciled with the Holy See. Their example was followed by about half a dozen clergymen and many more layfolk. But there were some ecclesiastical rebels who did not see their way to accept the papal claims, and who disapproved of what they regarded as the obscurantist opinions of Pope Pius X. All they wanted was to lead a Catholic life, and it really did not matter very much in the long run who was their ecclesiastical major superior, because they had grown accustomed to doing without one for many years, treating their Anglican bishops merely as machines for conferring holy orders and administering the sacrament of confirmation. So there was a lot to be said in favor of accepting the jurisdiction of the self-styled Archbishop of London and helping him to establish an English Catholic Church. It began to look as if there might be a future for such a body. Moreover, the modernist element in the Church of England was becoming more and more a cause of alarm, but it did not reach a climax until the publication of the collection of essays entitled Foundations in 1912. By this time, the Archbishop was in close touch with a small circle in London whose members encouraged his dreams and visions and gave him financial assistance. Among them were Madame Olga Novikov, sister of General Alexander Kiriev, and the Baroness Natalie Diuxkul, both of them ardent pan-Slavists. These two ladies were on friendly terms with almost all the leaders of movements on the continent for setting up non-papal national churches, including the Committee of Liberal Catholics in Italy. It was at their suggestion that Lord Llandaff wrote to the Holy Synod of Moscow, hopeful of the influence of General Kiriev with this Erastian body, so that its members would agree to the affiliation of the English Catholic Church with the Russian Patriarchate. The reply received was not encouraging. Accordingly, the Baroness Duxkull and Madame Novikov put their heads together and recommended that it might be worthwhile to tackle Archbishop Gerasimos Messera of Beirut, who had been sent to Europe by the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch to raise money. Doubtless these two ladies showed Matthew the article by Messera, who published in the Journal de Genève on January 20th, 1911, on the reunion of Christendom. Some of the statements suggested that the Archbishop of Beirut was a very broad churchman with a comprehensive Irenic outlook. It may be wondered if his patriarch was aware of the opinions promulgated in Switzerland. For instance, that it must be clear to all that a renewal of unity between the churches must have as its basis the complete preservation of all their respective rights and privileges. We publish this exhortation to the whole Christian world in the hope of finding in the hearts of all believers an echo of sincere sympathy. In doing this, we have fulfilled our fraternal duty and have set aside all responsibility for the divisions among Christians. Gerasimos Messera went to England during the summer of 1911. He met the Archbishop of Canterbury, but it seems that he did not receive much sympathy or the expected financial help. The Baroness Duxkull and Madame Novikov took him under their wing and arranged that he should be introduced to the Anglo-Catholic Archbishop of London. The result was that on August 5th, 1911, a conference took place at the Manor House Club, Bredon's, Norton, Worcestershire, which was Lord and Lady Llandaff's country address. There were present Archbishops Matthew and Messera, Bishop Scott Hall, Baroness Duxkull, Colonel Haggard, and Socrates Spiro Bay, a professor of Arabic at the University of Geneva. After a friendly discussion with his hosts, Messera agreed to receive the English Catholic Church into union with the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, and Matthew took an oath of allegiance to the absent patriarch. A document was drawn up in Arabic and translated into English by Socrates Bay. It is hard to believe that an Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch would have been prepared to accept a married prelate into communion with his church. Lady Llandaff did not take part in the conference, and it is probable that her existence behind the scenes was again kept dark, as at the time of her husband's consecration in 1908. This unprecedented union of what was legally merely a small English nonconformist sect with one of the historic Eastern churches was such an important event that 10 days later Bishop Bacon gave his nihil obstat, and Archbishop Matthew was imprimatur to a pamphlet entitled The Articles of Belief of the Old Catholics of Great Britain and Ireland of the Western Orthodox Church. Not satisfied with having obtained an apparent union with the Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch, the Baroness Duxkull and Madame Novikov urged Matthew to approach the vigorous and broad-minded Photios, Orthodox Patriarch of the great city of Alexandria and all Egypt. The result exceeded their expectations, for on February 13 through 26, 1912, His Holiness wrote to the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Western Orthodox Church, accepting him and his flock into union with the Patriarchate of Alexandria. He granted them permission to use the Latin rite, omitting the filioque, so long as the faithful in Great Britain and Ireland recognized the canonical ordinances of the 7 ecumenical councils, which form the basis of the Orthodox faith. As might be expected, the Primate of all England was surprised and displeased when he heard of what had been going on behind his back. It has been said that he dispatched Dr. Winnington Ingram to Syria, and on March 23, 1913, a bargain was made that this so-called act of union should be repudiated by the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. Nevertheless, according to Matthew's successor, Archbishop Williams, whether the backsheesh, which seems to have been considerable, fell short of his beatitude's expectations or not, we do not know. What we do know with absolute certainty is that no repudiation of this act of union was ever made. Neither does it appear that the Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria ever formally repudiated his pact before his death in 1925. But the English Catholic Church did not retain the title of the Western Orthodox Church for long, no more than a few months, as will be related. On April 18, 1913, the case Matthew versus the Times Publishing Company Limited came up before the King's Bench Division. It concerned defamation, libel, and the translation of a papal bull and its publication simply for the information of its readers, which the defendants maintained was not a contravention of 13 Elizabeth. For the words of this statute, publish or put in your means publishing so as to make the bull operative in this country. Mr. Roskill, K.C., and Mr. Hugh Fraser appeared for the plaintiff, and Mr. F. E. Smith, later Lord Birkenhead, for the defendants. The reputedly libelous article had been published in the Times on February 28, 1911. The defendants denied the meaning put by the plaintiff on the words complained of, and pleaded 1. That they were true in substance and in fact, 2. That they were a fair comment on matters of public interest, and 3. That they were privileged. The actual words which Matthew maintained amounted to libel were the translation of nefario crimini by wicked crime. He insisted that the correct translation was impious fault. This phrase occurred in the Acta Apostolicae Sedis on February 15, 1911, which contained the text of the excommunication of 3 Englishmen, Matthew, Beale, and Howarth, which, as stated in the Times, had been pronounced by Pope Pius X. Dated February 11, 1911, this papal decree warned the faithful against the pretensions and deceits of the persons mentioned, whose consecration was declared to be unlawful, sacrilegious, and wholly contrary to the commands of the Holy See and the sanction of the sacred canons. The persons themselves were excommunicated and anathematized, together with all others who to this wicked crime have given aid, counsel, or consent. They were ordered to be cut off from the communion of the Church, and as utterly schismatic, to be avoided by all Catholics. Cross-examined by F. E. Smith, Matthew made sufficiently wild and irresponsible statements to convince those in court that he was a pitiful clerical megalomaniac, deserving of sympathy rather than abuse. Mr. Justice Darling summed up and put the following questions to the jury. 1. Were the defendants actuated by malice in publishing the matter complained of? 2. Are the words true in substance and in fact? And 3. Damages. As to the damages, no evidence had been given that the plaintiff had been shunned by anyone in consequence of the publication. The jury answered the first question in the negative and the second in the affirmative, adding that they deprecated the publication of the bulls of the Pope of Rome in England, which affected the status of individuals. On the application of F. E. Smith, judgment was entered for the defendants with costs. So the poor Anglo-Catholic Archbishop of London had merely made himself the laughingstock of the British public, and he had to pay for his folly. Some of his statements during his cross-examination by F. E. Smith proved how utterly illogical and inconsistent he was. For instance, when he said, "I consider myself to be within the Roman Catholic Church, and the same church as to that to which the Pope belongs, and I have always been of that opinion," he must have forgotten for the moment that since he cast aside his Catholic priesthood in 1889, he had been both a Unitarian and an Anglican, as well as an Old Catholic. Having taken such trouble to widen his schismatic status by obtaining union with the Orthodox patriarchs of Antioch and Alexandria, it is hard to see how he could still regard himself as being in communion with the Patriarch of the West. After April 1913, the de jure Earl of Llandaff was treated lightly for the rest of his life, even by most of his followers, the majority of whom merely made use of his services for their own purposes, casting him aside when he had done the job wanted. But he could still count on the loyalty of the Baroness Duxcol and Madame Novikov. He was always sure of a welcome in the London salon presided over by the masterful and ever-scheming Belgian Baroness, whose advice he frequently sought. It was one or the other of these two ladies who introduced the Archbishop to a most distinguished Austrian nobleman, Rudolph Francis Edward St. Patrick Alphonsus Ghislain de Gramont Hamilton de Lorraine Brabant, Prince de Landesberg de Etrach, Duc de Saint-Winoc, It was well known that he was related to most of the European royal and noble families included in the Almanach de Gotha. It was not long before Count Povolari de Vicenza, Nogorote e Verona, 4th Earl of Landulf of Thomastown County, Tipperary, became close friends with the Prince de Landesbergs et Dirac, Duc de Saint-Winoc. They found that they had many interests in common. The former had a passion for genealogies and must have reveled in delving into the latter's long line of ancestors, starting in the early Middle Ages, among whom were Dukes of Lorraine and Brabant. The prince, though brought up in communion with the Holy See, prided himself on being liberal-minded and did not agree with Pius X that Arnold Harris Matthew was only a pseudo-bishop, cut off from the communion of the Church and utterly schismatic, who must be avoided by all the faithful. On the contrary, before very long, he said that he would like to be received into Matthew's Catholic Church, optimistic that it had a great future ahead. Then, with hardly a moment's delay, the illustrious convert was given the 4 minor orders, subdiaconate and diaconate, and raised to the priesthood in Bishop Bacon's oratory on November 21, 1912. 6 weeks after the Times libel case, on the feasts of Saints Peter and Paul, June 29, 1913, Prince de Landesberg et Dirac, Duc de Saint-Winoc, was consecrated by the Most Reverend and Right Honorable Archbishop of London. Some of those who recall this Austrian Prince-Bishop are of the opinion that, although he was indeed a fascinating, cosmopolitan, and cultured personality, he would have made trouble had he remained long in touch with Matthew. For one thing, it seems probable that he merely wanted to obtain the episcopate in order to set up a new anti-papal church on the continent, and felt that Matthew's aristocratic connections would be more useful to him than those of the old Catholic bishops in Holland, Germany, and Switzerland. As to the prelates of the Valois succession in France at that date, none of them could be said to come out of the top drawer. They were hardly the sort of men for a prince-bishop to consort with. Almost certainly, if he had remained in Britain, the Catholic Church, as it had come to be somewhat ambitiously called, would have split into 2 groups, those who had a social background and those who had not. The Baroness Duxkull and her circle would definitely have sided with the Prince Bishop, and Lord Landulf would have been almost certain to have done the same. Later on, a schism in the ranks did occur, but for very different reasons, as will be related. Matthew's flock was so small at all times that his archiepiscopal duties, even with the distractions involved by being a husband and the father of 3 children, allowed him more than enough leisure to turn out books and pamphlets. In 1912, he launched The Torch, described as a monthly review, advocating the reconstruction of the Church of the West and reunion with the old Orthodox Church of the East, of which only 3 issues appeared. For the benefit of his Anglo-Catholic Church, the Metropolitan composed a Catechism of Christian Doctrine, printed and published at Bromley, Kent. The Torch had a short-lived successor in the Union Review, which was also edited by the versatile Archbishop. Another booklet was the Ancient Catholic Church of Great Britain, of which he claimed to be the canonical head. He changed the title of his sect far more frequently than he had changed his own name in the past, and it was often difficult to remember what it was called from month to month. On March 15, 1914, the first and only issue of Le Revue Catholique was published in Paris. It contained a photograph with the caption Sa Grandeur Monseigneur A.H. Mathieu, Archevêque de l'Antre, Comte de Landau, Métropolitain de la Grande-Bretagne et d'Irlande, évêque provisoire de l'Église catholique française. Readers were informed that Monsignor Mathieu had agreed to consecrate a bishop for a new national church in France. An appeal was made to all French people who wished to be good Christians and Catholics without being ultramontanes or enslaved by the Jesuits to join this body. It offered many advantages. For instance, clerical celibacy would be abolished as being dangerous and contrary to nature, although voluntary celibacy would be permitted to members or religious orders. The veneration of images would be discouraged, and public worship would be in the vernacular. Meanwhile, the nascent church was under the jurisdiction of a vicar general. A small chapel dedicated to Blessed Joan of Arc had been opened in the passage Élysée des Beaux-Arts, Paris, It was expected that before long Monsignor Matthew would consecrate Monsignor Abbé de Mézières or whatever other priest might be elected as the first bishop of the Église catholique Francaise. But these dreams and visions faded out after Germany declared war against France on August 3, 1914. Ascension Day, 1914, was celebrated by Archbishop Matthew with the publication at Bromley, Kent, of the Catholic Church of England, its constitution, faith, episcopal succession, etc. It was typical of his pretentiousness to state that he had divided England into 5 ecclesiastical districts: London, Northern, Eastern, Western, and Southern, with London as the metropolitan see. Scotland would soon be raised to a vicariate apostolic. Obsessed with the delusion of his own importance, he was planning an international congress to be held in London, to which representatives of all the Catholic and apostolic churches in the world would be invited. Nothing like it had ever been thought of since the First Vatican Council of 1870, but that was on a very small scale compared to the congress Matthew dreamed of. Then the Metropolitan got down to brass tacks and ordered that his clergy were to use the Roman Missal, either in Latin or in English. The Most Reverend, the Right Honorable Archbishop of London, announced that he was prepared to reordain Anglican priests to ensure the validity of their orders. He proclaimed that his little sect was really the Old Catholic Church of England, because it taught only the faith of Old England, and it was taught when our forefathers all believed alike and worshipped together, and before any religious disputes, sects, and religious differences among Christians existed in this country. Having raised himself to the status of a supreme pontiff of a universal church, he felt it his duty to plant his new organization in many other countries, in each of which it would be autonomous. To stress its international importance, he printed the full texts of union with the patriarchates of Antioch and Alexandria. On the last page of his booklet was a photograph of the proposed Cathedral of Our Lady of England, with an appeal for £175,000 to erect it in London. Intoxicated with all these beautiful dreams and visions, the Archbishop must have felt, when he was celebrating Mass that Ascension Day, that the words of the offertory had indeed been fulfilled. God goes up, louder the cries of victory. The Lord goes up, loudly the trumpets peal. Alleluia. Any student of 19th century ecclesiastical architecture would have detected that the photograph of the London Cathedral had been taken from a model of a building erected more than 50 years previously. Matthew revealed his inspiration in a letter to Alan Hay, vicar of South Mimms, written in May 1914. He said, "I want a granite cathedral, a replica of the votive kirk at Vienna, a heaven-born design for a church which lifts the soul as its spires point to celestial spheres." Presumably the money was not coming in as fast as was expected, for on June 14th he informed the same correspondent that it would be madness to erect a great cathedral without sufficient endowment to keep it in repair, and sufficiently staffed. He added, "It is the ridiculous edifice at Westminster that causes anxiety. Those 3 large concrete domes crack. Fancy making such abominations." For the next 6 weeks, the Archbishop's dreams were mostly about the granite replica of the Vienna votive church, which he was determined to erect in the heart of London. Unfortunately, however, on June 28, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand and his morganatic wife, the Princess of Hohenberg, were assassinated at Sarajevo, with the result that on July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia. On August 4th, Britain was at war with Germany. During that summer, Matthew was not wholly preoccupied with his cathedral. He had been approached by an Anglican clergyman, the Reverend Frederick Samuel Willoughby, M.A., who told him a tragic story of how he had been forced to resign the living of St. John the Baptist, Stockton-on-Tees, because of Protestant persecution. Willoughby, ordained to the priesthood in 1888, was an extreme Anglo-Catholic, and had been the founder and first principal of St. Chad's Hostel, Houghton Pagnell, Yorkshire, 1899 to 1906, where candidates for the Anglican ministry were trained on high church lines. He had been the incumbent of this parish at Stockton since 1906. He explained to the Archbishop that certain of his flock had spread malicious gossip about his morals when he was away on holiday, and had informed Mr. Moule, Bishop of Durham, his lordship had not disclosed to Willoughby the nature of the serious charges made against him. After a private private investigation, the vicar was asked to resign his benefice. He did so, for like Dr. Moule, he did not want any further publicity, and eventually availed himself of the provisions of the Clerical Disabilities Relief Act of 1870 on January 19, 1915. The result of this shock, so Willoughby told Matthew, was a complete loss of faith in Anglicanism. Most of Matthew's friends appear to have agreed that he was genial, kindly, easily persuaded, scholarly, but utterly unbusinesslike. He was neither a good leader nor a capable administrator. He always wanted to do the right thing, but invariably he did the wrong one. On the other hand, his integrity was seldom questioned. When dealing with this ex-parson, he made one of the worst mistakes in his life. The Archbishop accepted Willoughby's statements on their face value and immediately offered to find work for him in what had now been renamed the Ancient Catholic Church of England. It is to be presumed that Llandaff did not read such popular weeklies as John Bull, which, in its issue of June 20th, 1914, stated that because of the revolting facts revealed, this clergyman was utterly unfit to act as the shepherd of a Christian flock. Any bishop at Matthew would have thought twice before taking on a cleric of such nationwide notoriety. No time was wasted. Willoughby, having been baptized conditionally, confirmed and given minor orders, subdiaconate and diaconate, was raised to the priesthood. Shortly after this, he was made a member of the cathedral chapter and able to wear a lace rochet and a black mozetta with a scarlet hood. In September 1914, Prince Bishop de Landesbergs et de Rache had left England for the United States with the connivance of the Foreign Office. As an Austro-Hungarian subject, it would have been necessary to intern him as an enemy alien. This might have been awkward because he was related to most of the royal families of Europe, so the Archbishop of London was left without a coadjutor. The titular bishops of Durham, Hereford, Norwich, and Winchester could not be relied on. 3 of them had already broken away from the Ancient Catholic Church of England, and the 4th was in Canada. On October 10th, Matthew sent a printed letter to his clergy, informing them that an election had taken place in which votes had been cast for 9 priests. Canon Wedgwood had received 6 votes, and Canon Willoughby 10. This gave the latter a clear majority, none of the others having obtained more than 4 votes each. The consecration of the former vicar of St. John's, Stockton-on-Tees, was carried out in the banqueting hall of the Bell Hotel, Bromley, Kent, on the feast of St. Simon and Jude, October 28, 1914. An altar and all the correct ornaments were hired from the firm of Jones and Wills. In an impressively worded Latin instrumentum consecrationis, it was stated that the most illustrious and most reverend Count Llandaff of Thomastown in Ireland had performed this solemn rite according to the Pontificale Romanum. The document was witnessed by 6 persons, including Canons Ferrer and King, both of them members of the Theosophical Society and the Order of the Star in the East. The new prelate was given the style of titular bishop of St. Pancras. All went well for a time, and the archbishop felt that he had found the ideal coadjutor. Willoughby's rapid promotion, however, disturbed some people who thought that Matthew ought to have gone further into the John Bull allegations and sought information from the Bishop of Durham before conferring any orders on this ex-Anglican incumbent with such a shady past. There were other troubles brewing, but in the first months of World War I, the ancient Catholic Archbishop of London seems to have been blissfully unconscious of them. For at least 2 years, perhaps longer, he had been in close touch with several leading theosophists, apparently without investigating the orthodoxy of their beliefs. One of his priests, Father Wedgwood, was already deeply implicated in the Theosophist movement. Matthew gave him permission to continue his active work for the Theosophical Society without compromising his position in the church, and went so far as to use Wedgwood's private oratory for administering baptism, confirmation, and minor orders on Willoughby. It is hard to say just how far Matthew grasped the heterodox opinions of the majority of his priests. On the other hand, his elusive mind may have been attracted to theosophy, just as it had been to Unitarianism a quarter of a century earlier. Father F. Adams, one of Matthew's few surviving friends, is convinced that he never accepted the theosophical doctrine that there are masters, i.e. supermen, who, instead of being released from the wheel of life and death after they become perfect, have elected to remain on this earth in order to help humanity in its struggle towards perfection. He certainly did not believe that the most exalted of these masters, the Lord Maitreya, assumed the body of Jesus nearly 2,000 years ago, and that in 1914 he was about to take the body of an Indian youth named Krishnamurti, who would be hailed as the 20th century Christ. Nevertheless, the Archbishop, if he read the newspapers, must surely have known that Krishna had been brought to England by Mrs. Annie Besant in 1911, but he may have been too preoccupied with his declaration of autonomy and independence. By 1914, this young Indian had had nearly 3 years of training at the expense of the Theosophical Society. That Matthew was taking a keen interest in theosophy is proved by a letter dated August 19, 1914, i.e. 2 months before Willoughby's election to the episcopate, which he wrote to Canon Reginald Ferrer, who was an active member of the society, as well as a priest of the ancient Catholic Church of England. He said, "I so often have seen a sort of mental vision of Mrs. Besant in the garb of an abbess. It is very curious, but I think something is working in her mind, and that she is seeing more clearly the divinity of the Catholic system and revelation, which is alone able to satisfy the soul's aspirations and longings."